Events in Syria have taken a further dramatic turn as Russia launched a series of airstrikes in the country, which the US says raises grave concerns about who the attacks were aimed at, the rebels fighting President Assad or the forces of Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant. With me here to discuss this latest development and its implications is Gideon Rachman, our chief foreign affairs commentator. Gideon, hello. What do you think the Russians are up to?
Well, I mean, obviously the most simplest explanation is that they've decided to get in there and bolster the Assad regime. Now, we don't know exactly how parlous the state of the Assad regime was, but we have an idea that they were really in control of only about a fifth of the country. The amount of territory they lost was partly disguised by the fact that they still controlled Damascus, the capital, and so on. But it's possible that it's simply as straightforward as the fact that their client, Assad, was on the way out. I think there are other broader motives as well, that they want to make a demonstration of Russian power in the Middle East, that they are players, that they can't be ignored, possibly a certain pleasure in wrong-footing the United States, and I think also changing the subject from Ukraine, where Russia has been kind of stuck for a few months, and opening up, if you like, a new front in the Middle East.
Right. You mentioned the phrase wrong footing, or apparently wrong footing, the Americans. How do you think they're going to respond to this?
Well, I think they are very confused. The Americans, have not had a very coherent policy to Syria for some years, because essentially they're torn between their distaste for Assad and their distaste for Islamic State. They've been promoting a moderate opposition that didn't really seem to be going anywhere in terms of having any chance of winning power. And I think that their confusion will only be amplified by these latest Russian actions. They certainly won't like this picture of Russia taking the initiative, telling the American aircraft to stay on the ground, all the more so since the propaganda line, if I can call it that, from Russia is that they're attacking Islamic State. But it seems to me seems to be increasingly clear that in fact most of the bombing raids, if not all of them, are directed not at the IS forces, but at the moderate or more moderate forces, including some that may in fact be receiving aid from the Americans. So you're looking at something that looks a little bit like a proxy war between Russian-backed forces and American-backed forces.
That's it. I mean, do you see any risk that we could have some horrible situation where there is almost a sort of, due to some mistake perhaps or whatever, that we do get a sort of conflict between?
Yeah, there's obviously a risk of that, because it's not such a big place, and both countries' air forces are in action over the skies of Syria. The Americans have been bombing Islamic State for some time. The Russians are now doing their own bombing raids. The American and Russian militaries are holding discussions, apparently today, to try to avoid that kind of what they call confliction, where the forces come across each other. But in a war, things can happen. And there's also, I think, an added danger, because although clearly neither side would actually want to end up shooting at each other, to put it bluntly, neither side would also want to be seen to be backing down and saying, okay, you first, particularly when they're backing opposite sides.
Right. I wanted to ask you, I mean, you've sort of alluded to it, but I mean, some people are sort of saying, President Putin has, played a sort of masterstroke of sorts, let's say it that way. But I mean, there's also quite a lot of risk for him in this, isn't there? I mean, I think you've just written a blog post on this saying, he possibly risks blundering into his own so-called war on terror. I mean, there's sort of quite a lot of downside for him.
I mean, I think we can see, it's a pattern throughout history, and certainly throughout recent history of the West, that when you go in initially in a military way, you can make a very dramatic splash. It looks very decisive, strong, all of that. But the first day is one thing, but what happens when the weeks go by, when you don't achieve your goals? Let's say that they need to double down to give Assad more support. At the moment they're saying no ground troops, but there's something like 2,000 Russian personnel who are heading towards Syria just to support the air operation. What happens when they start being killed, if they are killed? What happens further down the road if this does stir up Islamists who then attack within Russia itself? There are all sorts of very difficult calculations. Now, it's not to say that everything is going to go wrong, but clearly, once you go to war, you cannot predict the outcome.
Gideon Rachman, thank you. And thank you for watching. To catch up on more from the FT's comment team, please go to ft.com/comment.